All right, ready to get stuck in. We're going deep on the Battle of Passchendaele today. One of the, I mean, just brutal, brutal chapters of World War I. You
Yeah.
sent over some excerpts from that Wikipedia article. Looks like a pretty solid overview of the campaign.
Yeah, definitely. A story that really captures the just absolute horror and complexity of World War I, particularly the fighting on the Western Front.
Yeah, and I got to say, just from reading it, I'm already fascinated by how much the weather seems to have played a role in this whole thing. Like, I've seen pictures and it's just mud everywhere. How do you even fight a war in those conditions?
Well, you've hit on a really crucial point there, the conditions at Passchendaele and the way they impacted both the fighting and the decision making. They're essential to understanding everything that happened.
Okay, so before we get into the muck and the mire, literally, can we get some context? Like, where exactly are we talking about here? And why was this specific area so important?
So, the Battle of Passchendaele, also known as the Third Battle of Ypres, took place in the Ypres salient in Flanders, that's in Belgium. Just picture a bulge in the front lines, where the Allied forces were pushing out into German-held territory.
Okay, so I'm picturing like almost a bubble.
Yeah, exactly. And this wasn't just some random piece of land. The Germans had held that high ground around Ypres since 1914, and that gave them a real tactical advantage.
So like a hilltop fortress kind of thing. Whoever controls the high ground has the best view, the best firing positions.
Precisely. And control of the Ypres salient could potentially give either side the ability to launch offensives, disrupt enemy supply lines, maybe even open up a pathway to those crucial ports on the Belgian coast.
All right, the ports. The Allies desperately wanted to cut off the German U-boat activity.
That was definitely a key element. The British especially saw those ports as critical to winning the war at sea. But this is where the terrain itself becomes a major player.
Okay, so what was so special about this landscape?
Well, on a map, it might not look like much. You have these low ridges, these subtle dips. Some have even described it as a saucer lip around the city of Ypres itself.
Not exactly dramatic mountain ranges, then.
No, but these subtle features had a huge impact on the way the battle unfolded. Think about it. Drainage. Those ridges and dips meant that when the rains came, and they did, often, the water would collect in all those low-lying areas, turning the battlefield into this sea of mud.
Starting to get a real sense of the challenge here.
And that mud made movement, supply, basically everything about fighting a war incredibly difficult.
Yeah, you mentioned that before, and it's hard to overstate just how much of an impact that would have had. But okay, so to fully understand why the Allies launched this massive offensive in 1917, we need some backstory, right? What led up to this point?
You're right. The 1917 campaign didn't just come out of nowhere. We need to go back to the very beginning. So Belgium had declared neutrality at the start of the war, but Germany invaded anyway, violated that neutrality, and that ultimately pulled Britain into the conflict.
Belgium caught in the crossfire.
Exactly. Then in 1914, you had the race to the sea, both sides trying to outflank each other, desperately trying to avoid getting bogged down in a stalemate. That's really how the Western Front as we know it took shape. The First Battle of Ypres, also in 1914, solidified that German hold on that crucial high ground. Then you have some limited British operations in 1915 and 1916, all of which built up the tension in this area. So by 1917, the Ypres salient was a powder keg waiting to explode.
Wow, so years of this back and forth, each side probing for weaknesses. So when the Allies decided to launch this offensive in 1917, what was the plan? What did they hope to achieve?
Well, their objective was ambitious, to say the least. The idea was to capture Messines Ridge as a preliminary step. They actually achieved that relatively quickly in June of 1917, but then they wanted to push north through Passchendaele, aiming to break through the German lines and reach the Belgian coast.
They're trying to cut off the entire German army in that area.
Essentially, yes. And by controlling those ports, the British hoped to severely cripple the German U-boat campaign. But here's where things get really interesting. This strategy wasn't universally supported.
Wait, so there was dissent within the Allied ranks.
Absolutely. Some key figures had serious reservations. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, for example, he wasn't convinced. Neither was Ferdinand Foch, the French chief of staff. They both preferred a strategy of attrition.
Attrition meaning like wearing down the enemy over time, rather than risking a huge, decisive battle.
Precisely. They argued that a massive offensive like this, especially given the terrain, could backfire spectacularly. But the man in charge of the British Expeditionary Force, General Douglas Haig, he was a firm believer in the need for decisive victory.
So he's the one who really pushed for this all-out attack.
He was. Haig felt that breaking through at Ypres, capturing those ports, could potentially knock the Germans out of the war entirely. He saw it as the key to ending the stalemate on the Western Front.
Wow, so we have this clash of philosophies, attrition versus decisive battle, all playing out against this incredibly challenging terrain. Haig gets his way. The offensive is launched in late July 1917. What happens next?
Well, right from the start, things don't go exactly according to plan. On July 31st, the British launched their initial attack on Pilkem Ridge. It was a dark, chaotic affair, hampered by heavy rain and mud.
That mud again. It's like the third character in this whole story at this point.
It really is. And it only got worse. August of 1917 saw the wettest weather in the region in 30 years. The battlefield, which was already a mess of shell craters and trenches, became a literal quagmire.
I can't even imagine trying to coordinate an attack, let alone move heavy equipment in that.
It was chaos. The mud slowed everything down, made it incredibly difficult to move troops and supplies. It also created ideal conditions for disease to spread. Trench foot, infections, you name it.
So even with some initial success, the Allies were already facing immense challenges. Did they adapt their tactics in response to this, or were they just determined to push forward regardless?
Well, that is where the story gets even more fascinating. Both sides would be forced to adapt, to innovate, and to make incredibly difficult decisions as the battle raged on. It's easy to look back at these battles, like Passchendaele, and just criticize the commanders for not seeing. You know how those conditions would impact their plans. But we have to remember this was a new kind of war.
Yeah, the scale, the technology, the sheer brutality, nothing like it had ever been seen before. So how did the Allies respond to these challenges they were facing? Did they just keep throwing men into the meat grinder? Or did they try to adapt?
Well, the initial strategy of those large-scale assaults, those massive pushes designed to overwhelm the enemy, they just weren't working. Not in the face of the mud and the German defenses. So by September and October, the British started to shift their tactics.
Okay, so what did this new approach look like? Did they scale back their ambitions, become a bit more cautious?
Yes, exactly. They started focusing on shorter, more controlled advances. Instead of trying to capture vast swaths of territory all at once, they aimed to take smaller objectives, consolidate their gains, dig in, and then repeat the process.
Makes sense. Less exposure to enemy fire, easier to resupply, and probably less exhausting for the troops, slogging through all that mud.
All good points. And to support these smaller advances, they significantly increased their artillery firepower. The creeping barrage became a key tactic, where artillery fire would essentially walk ahead of the advancing infantry.
So like a moving wall of explosions clearing the way.
Yeah, a brutal but effective tactic. The idea was to suppress enemy defenses, break up their lines, and create a path for the infantry to follow, and it did have a significant impact. A good example is the Battle of the Mending Road Ridge. It took place from September 20th to 25th. A well-planned British victory. It demonstrated that they were learning, adapting to the situation.
So the Allies were starting to figure things out. But I'm sure the Germans weren't just standing around watching this happen. How did they respond to these new tactics?
Oh, the Germans were incredibly skilled and adaptable soldiers, masters of defense. And they quickly realized they needed to evolve their own tactics to counter what the Allies were doing.
What kind of changes did they make?
Well, one key change was dispersing their troops more widely, made them less vulnerable to concentrated artillery fire.
Yeah.
They also strengthened their front lines with more machine guns, reinforced concrete pillboxes, those little fortified positions scattered throughout their lines.
Little bunkers.
Exactly. And perhaps most importantly, they started using their counterattack divisions more effectively.
Counterattack divisions, so they're holding back some of their forces, ready to strike back quickly if the Allies make a breakthrough.
Exactly. Instead of just trying to hold every inch of ground, they were willing to give up some territory, let the Allies advance into their prepared positions, and then hit them hard with a well-coordinated counterattack. One of the key figures in this German response was a general named Fritz von Lossberg. He played a crucial role in shaping these defensive adaptations, emphasizing flexibility, depth, and resilience.
So it sounds like the Germans were constantly learning, adapting, finding ways to turn their defensive positions into death traps. Did this make it even harder for the Allies to gain any real momentum?
Absolutely. Even with their improved tactics, the British still faced setbacks. The Battle of Polygon Wood, for example, technically a victory, but it was still incredibly costly. And the German counterattacks at the end of September showed just how determined they were to hold their ground.
So even with these adjustments, it doesn't sound like the Allies were getting any closer to their goal of reaching the coast. Were they starting to have doubts about the whole strategy at this point?
Well, the Battle of Broodsein, which took place at the beginning of October, was a crucial moment. The British managed to capture a key ridge, but they failed to exploit their success. The Germans were incredibly quick to counterattack and plug any gaps in their lines.
So even when the Allies did make progress, it was often at a terrible cost. And they struggled to turn those small victories into anything decisive. Did they ever actually manage to capture the village of Passchendaele itself?
They did, but the path to that victory was paved with blood and mud. Before we get there, though, it's important to understand that the cost of victory continued to rise. The Battle of Polkapelle on October 9th was another grueling engagement, and it highlighted the limitations of even the most well-planned tactics when facing those determined defenses
Yeah.
and those horrendous weather conditions.
I bet that mud was just a constant factor, always there to slow things down, make life miserable, just amplifying the suffering. It must have felt like they were fighting the terrain itself.
You're absolutely right. And then came the First Battle of Passchendaele, launched on October 12th. It was, to put it bluntly, a disaster. Heavy rain, exhausted troops, and those incredibly strong German defenses all combined to make it a costly failure.
So at this point where the Allies on the verge of giving up, was morale completely shattered?
They were in a tough spot, no doubt. Morale was low, casualties were high, and the objective seemed as far away as ever. But there were a couple of events that happened around this time that helped to shift the tide, at least temporarily.
Okay, a glimmer of hope.
On October 22nd, a smaller British action diverted some German attention and resources, but the more significant event was the French victory further south, at the Battle of La Malmaison.
Right, the battle where the French really punched through the German lines.
Yes, that's the one. This French victory forced the Germans to divert troops away from Passchendaele, gave the British a much-needed breathing space.
So did this French success provide the opening the British needed to finally take Passchendaele?
It certainly helped. With the Germans somewhat weakened, the Canadians were tasked with making the final push. The Canadian Corps had already gained a reputation for their tenacity and skill, and they were relatively fresh, having arrived later in the campaign.
The Canadians, it's interesting how they seem to have almost become specialists in taking on some of the toughest objectives of the war. Like their performance at Vimy Ridge earlier in 1917 was incredible.
Their reputation as tough, capable soldiers was definitely well-deserved.
So the stage is set, the Canadians are in position, the Germans are weakened, but still holding on to Passchendaele. How did this final battle play out?
The Second Battle of Passchendaele, as it became known, took place from October 26th to November 10th. The Canadians, under the command of Arthur Currie, launched a methodical three-stage assault on the village and the surrounding ridges.
I'm guessing they were a bit more careful, a bit more deliberate than the earlier British attacks.
Absolutely. Currie was a meticulous planner, and he insisted on thorough preparation and a well-coordinated attack. The Canadians advanced cautiously, utilizing creeping barrages, lots of machine guns, and even some innovative new techniques, like sound ranging, to pinpoint German artillery positions.
Sound ranging. So they're using technology to essentially listen for the enemy guns. That's pretty cutting edge for 1917.
It was. Shows how both sides were constantly looking for ways to gain an advantage, leverage new technology, just improve their chances of survival.
Yeah, in this brutal conflict.
But even with all of this, the battle for Passchendaele was still incredibly hard-fought. The first two stages of the Canadian attack on October 26th and 30th were successful, but the final push for Passchendaele itself was delayed.
Why was that?
More rain.
Oh, that mud. It just never gives up.
It's a constant throughout this whole campaign. But finally, on November 6th, after a brief spell of drier weather, the Canadians launched their final assault and captured Passchendaele.
Victory at long last.
Yeah.
But given everything we've talked about,
Yeah.
the conditions, the intensity of the fighting, I can only imagine the cost.
You're right, it was a victory, but a Pyrrhic victory. The Canadians suffered heavy casualties, and the village of Passchendaele itself was reduced to a pile of rubble. When you look at the total losses for both sides during the entire Third Battle of Ypres, it's staggering. Hundreds of thousands of men killed or wounded for just a few miles of mud.
It really highlights the sheer brutality and senselessness of war, doesn't it? All that sacrifice for such limited gains. So after the Canadians captured Passchendaele, did the fighting just stop? Or did the back and forth continue?
Well, the capture of Passchendaele did mark a turning point in the battle. The intensity of the fighting decreased significantly, but it didn't stop entirely.
So even in victory, there was no rest for the weary.
That's the reality of the Western Front in World War I. This constant pressure, this constant threat, even when there weren't full-scale battles raging.
I can only imagine the psychological toll that would take.
It was immense. The constant shelling, the mud, the ever-present danger, grueling existence.
And we can't forget that the fighting continued in other sectors of the Western Front as well. Passchendaele was just one piece of this much larger, much more complex conflict.
Exactly. But even though the fighting at Passchendaele had subsided, the debate about the battle and its significance was just beginning.
So even after the guns fell silent at Passchendaele, the echoes of that battle, they continued to reverberate, didn't they? I mean, what were the lasting consequences of this campaign? Was it a strategic victory for the Allies? Did it change the course of the war?
Well, that's really where the controversy begins. You see, despite the enormous cost in lives and resources, Passchendaele didn't really achieve any major strategic breakthroughs for the Allies. The Germans, despite being pushed back, they continued to hold strong defensive positions.
So all that sacrifice, all that suffering, for what? A few miles of mud.
That's the question a lot of people asked, both at the time and in the years that followed. Some argue that General Haig, the British commander, he was too fixated on this idea of a decisive battle,
Yeah.
that he underestimated the challenges of the terrain and the weather, and that he needlessly sacrificed thousands of lives for very limited gains.
Yeah, I can see how that argument would resonate,
Yes.
especially given the scale of the losses.
It's a debate that continues to this day. Some historians believe Haig was a capable commander, just dealt a difficult hand, while others are much more critical of his decisions.
Right, some of those historical debates that might never be truly settled. But what about the impact on the soldiers themselves? How did Passchendaele affect the men who fought there?
Well, for the Germans, Passchendaele just further drained their manpower and resources, contributed to their growing exhaustion and war weariness. For the British, and especially for the Canadians, Passchendaele became a symbol of both the horrors of trench warfare and the tenacity of their soldiers.
So while the strategic significance of the battle might be debatable, there's no doubt that it had a profound impact on the men who fought there, on their morale, on their view of the war itself.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to remember that Passchendaele, for all its tragedy, it also pushed both sides to innovate, to adapt their tactics, and to develop new technologies.
Right, like we talked about the Canadians' use of sound ranging to locate enemy artillery. And the Germans were constantly refining their defensive tactics.
Exactly. In a way, Passchendaele foreshadowed the kind of industrialized, technologically advanced warfare that would come to define the 20th century.
It's a sobering thought. Even in the midst of such horror, the machinery of war keeps grinding on, driving innovation and, sadly, leading to even more destructive capabilities.
Yeah, that's the paradox of war, isn't it? It's a catalyst for both incredible human ingenuity and unimaginable human suffering.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. From the strategic objectives to the tactical innovations to the human cost, we've really delved into the complexities of this pivotal battle.
It's a battle that deserves to be remembered, not just for its place in the history books, but for the lessons it teaches us about leadership, about the impact of technology on warfare, and about the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity.
Yeah, and for you listening out there, we hope this deep dive has provided you with some valuable insights into the Battle of Passchendaele. But the exploration doesn't have to end here. There are so many books, documentaries, and online resources available to help you delve even deeper into this fascinating and tragic chapter of history.
And as you continue to learn about Passchendaele, think about the individual stories of the soldiers who fought there. Imagine yourself in their boots, slogging through the mud, facing that constant threat of death. What would have been going through their minds? How did their experiences shape their lives and the lives of their families, long after the guns fell silent?
Those are powerful questions. And by grappling with them, by engaging with this history on a personal level, I think we can gain a deeper understanding of the true cost of war and the importance of striving for peace.
Well, until our next deep dive, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
Thanks for joining us.